Hello and welcome. Angela joins me today for another one of our Singella sessions, as we call them, where we dive deep into either a title associated with ancient faces of the goddess or explore a whole goddess. So today we are doing Propylaia, which is a title of the goddess that is really fascinating, but I also find it's you can kind of connect to it like in an intuitive way, like Propylaia, the gate. She's also the gatekeeper and the keeper of keys. So intuitively, a lot of us are drawn to that aspect of, like, so let's say Hecate as being like she's the gatekeeper, and also the keeper of the keys. But then to articulate like what that means to us, to try to pull that into a more intellectual discussion, I have found this over the years to be really challenging. And it's interesting because I, of course, called what's become now an organization, but was years ago just a little blog, Keeping Her Keys. And that, I think that's like Propylaia or Clydocus, like these titles of Hecate. It's like there is magic, there's mystery in it, but every once in a while, it just happened recently, someone will be like, what do you call it, Keeping Her Keys? But people really love Keeping Her Keys. Like, it was even like when it first came out, it got an award for being like the best pagan witchy blog title of the year. But it's like, what does it actually mean? So we're going to go in deep with Propylaia, the gate, the gatekeeper, the membrane, the threshold. And this is really a continuation of Enodia, the road goddess, which we did last month. So if you think of like that metaphor, like one aspect of Hecate is this road goddess, that she's going to see you through the roads. And then there was another ancient appellation called Propylaia, which meant big fancy gate, but also meant that she is like the gate itself. So we're continuing from Enodia and we're coming to something new. We're coming to a threshold and something new. So I don't know, this is really fascinating to me.
I
Obviously,
agree.
being
Yeah.
me, I'm obviously quite enchanted by this whole business of the different titles of Hecate and like, what do they actually, like, what do they mean? Like, why are we so drawn to that? So we're going to talk about the history and what we think, some of the reasons might be that we're so drawn to the energy of like thresholds and gates. Um, so just brew a cup of something. We're doing bees this month, so maybe get some tea with some honey in it. Get your notebook and get comfy because here we go. Angela is joining us from Italy, where it is a heat wave,
Mhm.
and I am from breezy coastal Nova Scotia. So I'm just going to start by trying it. We do have heat warnings here, but on the open Atlantic Ocean like this, like our heat warnings are different.
Yeah. Yeah. You get a little bit more relief.
Yeah, we get relief. Like it's foggy, humid, hot here, which is a weird combination. But so I'm going to send some of that like across the Atlantic, and you can just hopefully get a little bit cooler.
I was telling Cindy earlier that I went to the lake today and there were all these planes flying really low and they were very cute and charming. And somebody said, they're going to put out fires.
It's
They were
horrible.
charming.
They're
Yeah.
still charming little planes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into Propylaia. It's the middle of summer. Everywhere it's hot. Cool off with us as we contemplate the gate.
The gate.
I did something. Start the slideshow.
This is very cute.
There we go. The gate. Okay, so it's like, where do we begin in talking about the ancient history about this business of like the idea that a goddess is basically a gate? Like, so she's gatekeeper, but she's also like the physical gate, like the gate itself. Um, and so I looked in this book, which is a really great resource for all, like just an overview of different religious practices in the ancient Mediterranean.
Mhm.
And one of the things that was really important to the ancient Greeks was that the temple, like the different, like the structure of the temple. So there's the idea that the sanctuary, the temenos, was a special part of these temple complexes. And temenos, of course, is a term that Carl Jung used to talk about like our internal reality. So temenos is like a sacred space, and this sacred space would have been walled off or have, and then have some type of gate. And that in order to cross through these gates, you had to go through rituals, like you had to do purification rituals. So I think for me, in thinking about like in terms of the statues of Hecate that were Propylaia, that were part of these entrances to these temples, if we can just imagine what the experience would have been of someone approaching the Propylaia and maybe seeing a shrine to Hecate at this Propylaia, like what their experience would have been. I think that's really interesting
Mhm.
because I think like in the Catholic Church, you're still supposed to do something like this, right? Like I haven't been to a Catholic mass for a long time, so I wouldn't be an expert. But like when you come into the sanctuary, you do like you cross yourself.
Yeah, and you sometimes have the holy water in the basin.
Right. So it's still like that idea that when you cross into a sanctuary, like a religious structure that's sacred space, that you're crossing from the everyday into something holy, and that you do this through rituals. And even like I said, even today in the Catholic Church, and I think other religions probably do this too.
Mhm.
There's some kind of thing. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and we had none of that. You just like you just walked into the doors and got down to business. Um, and so I've been thinking a lot about this, like this idea that in a lot of the world, like when we go into a building that is sacred to us, like we don't really have any rituals anymore, or even an important building. Like so for the idea of the Greeks and others in the ancient Mediterranean that you had to cleanse yourself, you were crossing through this membrane between one aspect of life and another one. In the terms of a temple, it was more sacred. And that you had to cleanse yourself, at least in a ritualistic sense, even if you weren't 100% clean. You know what I mean? Like there was something energetically that prepared you for crossing through the gate into something more sacred.
Yeah, you're making me think about the last time I was in San Francisco. My sister wanted to give me a tour of her work. So we were walking down the streets and I walked into the wrong building. I don't know why I assumed that this was her building. I just turned into a building and walked into it. And she said, "No, this is the wrong building." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she said, "No, it's fine. Every building in San Francisco is public space." And I don't know why, but that really struck me as really resonant because of this feeling that San Francisco has changed so much, and it's now kind of designed for everyone to kind of have this tech experience. There's something that's been sort of desacralized about even businesses in San Francisco that this makes me think about. But another thing that I was thinking about was, we talk about this a lot. The Greeks had multiple ideas of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing that we associate with consciousness now, this thing that we think is internal, was external from the Greek perspective. So the material was naturally always spiritual. Talking about this crossing of thresholds, it was also crossing into another dimension, and you had to physically perform the acts in order to purify yourself spiritually in preparation for this other place.
I think that's so interesting. And I like how you mentioned San Francisco because when I was reading this book,
Mhm.
I was struck by the idea, like, so basically in society, we had done away with all of these kind of purification rites,
Yeah.
maybe excepting the Catholic Church and some other faiths. Um,
Islam still does it.
Islam still does it, but most of us who, because we live in a world that is very secular, most of us don't have this experience that we have to purify ourselves in order to be suitable to be in a place. Except, of course, when the pandemic came. And, what do we all do when we go into buildings now? Like, we purify ourselves, we use hand sanitizer.
Yeah.
And I
Also, with the convention of taking off your shoes when you enter somebody's house, that's a lot more common now.
right, that, yeah. So we do, in a practical sense, have these little purification rituals when we cross a threshold, when we go through a gate.
Hmm.
Um, but I think because we live a life where we don't have that kind of Greek understanding, that we are operating on many different levels, from the very mundane to the kind of deeper, even like ascended self. Um, that we just see these things as, well, we're just sanitizing our hands so we don't get germs,
Yeah.
or we're taking off our shoes because I don't want to ruin their carpets, but there is a deeper element to these things that we perform if we
Mhm.
can attend to them.
Yeah.
And I think, like, however you're engaging with the spirit of Propylaia this month, I would say, begin with just being cognizant of when you're crossing one threshold to another, and seeing thresholds, seeing gates, doorways as like spirits and places onto themselves, and that every doorway we go through, like, it represents a transition.
Hmm. This
Uh,
also has a practical function, right? Like behavioral psychology has shown that not doing work inside your bed, like not bringing your computer into your bed, helps you sleep better and helps you really sort of firmly associate that space with rest. So you can kind of think of any space in your house in these terms, like what is the space for and how do I designate it that way?
right. And when I cross that threshold, like when I go from office, in my case, to bedroom,
Hmm.
and the different nature of what I do there. Now, if you live in like a one room situation, this was probably a little bit more challenging, but you can even start to set up like thresholds, like from the kitchen area to the eating area to the relaxing area to this, like, and to kind of see all of these like as parts of your personal temple that you live in, and what kind of rituals you might do to delineate the spaces that you go through.
Yeah, or even like how you dress for them. Like I'm sure that a lot of us who grew up in America have this memory of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right? And how he would
Yeah.
enter the house and he would change his cardigan and change his shoes.
Oh, yeah.
Love that little ritual.
I mean, I still do that. Like, one of my threshold rituals when I come home is I get changed. Like, if I've been out in the world doing like world things, out in the out in the marketplace or wherever, I get changed before I leave, and then when I come home, part of my homecoming purification ritual is like I get changed. First of all, the bras I wear out in public are not the bras I wear at home.
You wear
So
bras at home?
what?
You wear bras at home?
Well, home bras.
Okay. I don't know what a home bra is.
I live with sons.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I live in a place, where that someone can knock at the door without knowing. Speaking of thresholds. So I think there's a lot, like, if we just start to bring into awareness of how we are already navigating thresholds. Because, like, yes, this lofty thing of we're at Eleusis and we're doing like the great rites, and we're going to do these purification rituals and kill the goat, and do all this stuff before we go into the temple. See, like, yes, that is perhaps like the highest form of a Propylaia kind of experience to cross those thresholds, but it's a continuum, and I think we need to have more of that perspective, that more Greek perspective, that what we do in the very mundane sense also stretches up into like the deeper etheric ascended self sense. Like, there's
Always.
always, right? Yes, obviously, going into the bathroom is not the same as going into a sacred temple to do a ritual, but it's on a continuum. And I think that, especially with Hecate and her association with like crossroads, a lot of people do crossroads rituals, and we've been talking about this in Covina and the Keeping Her Keys book club. And like people, like I really do advocate for people like doing a nighttime crossroads ritual at least once. It's intimidating, and I think it's a really powerful experience. It is like crossing a threshold into something else, because for most people that's not something they would normally do. So there's those kind of thresholds, those gates we go to, and it's just like breaking out of the kind of fears we have. There's that whole aspect to it too. But at the same time, hello, in your house, if you live in a multi-room dwelling, you have a house full of crossroads, right? You have the crossroads between the kitchen and the hall and upstairs and downstairs. Like there's just thresholds are all around us all the time.
Yeah.
And so
spaces of traffic.
Yes, exactly. So start paying attention to those thresholds and the gates that you're always passing through. Back to ancient history. So this is from this wonderful German dissertation. I don't read German very well, and I don't think you do either, do you?
Mm-mm.
So my efforts to translate this, which has not been published in English anywhere, are slow going, but it is a very juicy thesis about temples, and especially Propylaia, and has a lot to say about Hermes, our friend Hermes, and Hecate, because the two of them were both Propylaia and had a lot to do with threshold. So let's just read this quote. As a gate goddess, Hecate was not only venerated at the stairway to the Athens Acropolis, but also in other Greek cities. In Selinunte, Hecate was also on watch from a propylon. So a propylon, like, is basically, like this kind of thing, or a little shelfy thing. By the sanctuary of Demeter in Eleusis, Hecate owned a temple at the gates of the sanctuary on Rhodes. Hecate was worshipped as Propylaia together with Hermes, Propylaios, the masculine, and Apollon, Apotropaios. In Lagina, so that was her main temple, a statue of Hecate was erected when a new city gate was being built. In addition, there was also this really fascinating annual procession in Lagina in honor of Hecate, where a young female, a girl, a kore, led the procession of keys. And a similar festival was also held in a town not too far away, Miletus. So there is all of this business about Hecate and gates. And I want to make two big points here. One is that in a lot of the remaining historical record, Hecate was like a Propylaia. She was a gate and associated with the gate to temples to other divinities. So the Acropolis, I know there's like Nike. So all these temples at Eleusis, which was Demeter and Persephone. So all these temples were dedicated to other deities, but Hecate, and often accompanied by Hermes, would be the gatekeeper to these things. So that's a lot. I find that's a lot to take in. And it reminds me of like something I've bumped into a few times, where I'm reading some text about Hecate, and the author will have said, well, Hecate was a really minor goddess because she was liminal, and she didn't have the big ass temple. She was at the gate to the temple, so that meant that she was less than. Or like that, there's this image of Cybele where Hecate and Hermes are on either side of her, and they're quite small, and she's like massive. And so that's something I actually I think a lot about this. I was like, so is the liminal one, is the gate that gets you into like the mysteries of Cybele, or the mysteries of Persephone, or Nike, or Apollo, like whoever. Like, I don't see that as being less than the thing that you're going to. because like if you can't get through the gate, you're never going to get to that thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I don't think she's like an ancient security guard. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think we have a tendency to downplay things that are related to transitions, right? Like
Yeah.
people often say the same thing about Hermes. Like he was not very important. He was just a messenger. But obviously there's so much to unpack about Hermes and how he impacts our lives. It's not an accident either that just like Hecate, he's also a road god,
Mm.
and related to all the sorts of chants that you can have on the road. And I think the interesting thing about Hecate is that she contains both of these epithets, right? Like Enodia, but also Propylaia. There's a huge difference between being, a road goddess and a gate goddess. Because when you're on the road, you're on a vein and you're vulnerable. You're the thing that's vulnerable there because there are so many things that might, you know, get into your space on that road. But when you're approaching a gate, like, and you and I, we can talk about this a little bit more later, but, you and I have talked about the secret name of Rome and how seriously, spiritually and materially, the fortifications of
Mm.
cities were taken. The gate introduces you into that city as a foreign body. So the fact that there's an entity at the gate, the fact that there's sort of like this idea of the gate as a spiritual place in and of itself also invites this idea, which is related to growth mindset, that whatever you do as somebody who's entering this space, be it a city or a temple, you're going to change it. You're going to somehow contaminate it and mix with it. And so that's quite a, I don't know, that's quite a significant thing,
Right. And I think it's so like foreign to how we view things today,
Yeah, yeah. We're
right?
very point A to point B, and those are the only things that matter. Yeah.
And we don't even notice like I was thinking about this. I was like I was trying to think like how many people do I know who actually have some kind of like talisman or ritual or something like when someone comes into their home that they do.
Mm.
So like even having like an evil eye up by the door, or you might like a little shrine to Hecate, or having some kind of charm at the door. Like
Hmm.
I think I remember this being a lot more common that people would have something, or even like if you're like so inclined, like you might have like a crucifix,
Hmm. Or
some kind,
horseshoes.
or a horseshoe over the door. That's a good one. So this idea that there is like something to protect
Yeah.
that threshold. So who crosses through it when they come into the environment, they'll bring only like good wishes into the environment, like that kind
Yeah.
of protective energy, which is really important. And when we're talking about like ancient temples, whether it's Hecate or Hermes who are serving this role as being the gate, like that's a really central role
Yeah.
because whatever goes on in the temple is not going to happen um, if they don't do their job.
The bouncer at the
The
door.
bouncer at the door, like they're the ones that ID you. It's like, like you
It's
can't get
true.
in without them,
Yeah, and everybody knows that the bouncer is the most important person.
right? Okay, so it's like we're talking about temples. I think we touched just a little tiny bit on the idea that, so I want to expand on it now. So they did this at temples, but that people also did this at their houses. So there's three kind of places this was done. Hecate and Hermes often they were at these entrances to temples, so they were that kind of gate. They were at the entrances to cities and towns and different places within a city or town. And then people also did this for their own homes and
Mm,
had that protection there. So this was very, it was kind of very multi-leveled. That it went
yeah.
right from these super sacred spaces to like the everyday home. That Hecate and Hermes were the gates and they were the gatekeepers, and so on. And to bring our friend Hesiod and his theogony into the conversation, like we often do, to look for some kind of like, why Hecate? Like, why would she potentially be chosen for this role as like the Greek state evolves and later, the Romans and so on. So there's this theory that Hecate like was a foreign, well, spirit, like that she was a foreign expression of the goddess, and so she was always going to be an outsider to the Greeks. But Hesiod wrote that she was super important and she was a titan, which were like the old gods.
Mm-hmm.
And because she basically betrayed her family, she got to hang out with the Olympians, and that even Zeus gave her dominion over land, sea, and sky. So there's this thing where she's the gate between all these worlds. She might not be the one who owns the worlds, but because she is the gate between these worlds, she has free reign in all territories. And this was also applied to like practical terms. And that if you read the passage from Hesiod describing Hecate, that she's not the kind of dark, mysterious goddess associated with witchcraft. She is very much this goddess, this spirit that you would want, like watching over your house and watching over your city and watching over your temple, because I think that can be going into the discussion of Propylaia. And I was thinking a lot about like where do we kind of introduce this into this class, but for a lot of us who may think of Hecate as being like the queen of witches, and she's associated with sorcery and pharmakeia and Medea, Circe, and all this kind of scary stuff. That she is like the scary, like how can she be the gate when it seems like she's kind of the scary thing that we would want whoever's in charge of the gate to keep out. But if we look at to what Hesiod had to say about her, it's like, oh yeah, she's lovely. Of course, we would have her watching over our houses, because if we do the right things for her, she's going to take good care of us. So I always think that's really interesting, that there is this really complicated web about how people in the ancient Mediterranean, even right up until today, how they understand Hecate. But there is this very kind of old thread in this, one of the oldest sources where Hecate is named, that sees her as this kind of like great mother who watches over cities and so on.
There's something, what's coming to mind for me is integration. Like there's regardless of whether the Greeks were really thinking of her as a foreign goddess or whether they were thinking of her in terms of like this titan who gets this special accommodation with the Olympians that other titans don't get. There's something here about integration. Like if you've ever been an outsider anywhere and had to work your way in and learn the rules and stumble and fall and kind of master the rules, for example, in the context of immigration or like in a new workplace situation, there's something about like just these words, like performing fine sacrifices according to custom, like this implication that you enter the space, you're going to agree to abide by the rules, right? Because every space has its own kind of context and its own rules of engagement. So there's also something about being an outsider and mastering those rules in a particular way that gets you a different kind of accommodation, right? Like people think of you as an insider, but you're remembered as this outsider in a way that's not dangerous anymore, in a way that's fun. And as somebody who can vet outsiders, you can be trusted with that job.
Oh, I really like that. And it just kind of like in a spiritual sense, it makes me think of like if we are working with Hecate, like in terms of healing, or we want to just understand ourselves in the universe better, whatever it is, that as the gate, she is the one who can help us explain to us what might happen inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Because
to
she
best,
knows that territory. Like she knows all the territories there are.
Yeah.
So she's like, I'm here at the gate. I am the gate. You've got to pass through me in some kind of initiatory aspect, of cleansing or whatever to get through. And I'm also like, even though I might be the gate, I'm also the guide because I
Hmm.
know what goes on in whatever I'm initiating you into. I know what goes on in there.
Yeah. And she also knows the transition intimately, having done it herself in her more macro God way.
Oh, yeah. Like it's, yeah. So I think
Yeah.
that really kind of links the idea, like, because what you said earlier about a node is about momentum and movement. And whereas like Propylaia, that's about stability. Like gates don't go anywhere.
No.
So I think that's really interesting. Okay, we've done our Hesiod bit for today. We'll move
Thank
on.
you, Yad.
Thank you, Hesiod. Okay, this is a bit of a hodgepodge of different sources that just demonstrate how Hecate was like a Propylaia at different temples. So I think this one is from um, oh, so this article talks a lot about different statuary of Hecate that would have been like Propylaia. They would have been at gates.
Okay.
Okay, so this one here is really interesting because I like this. This is really intact, right? Like a lot of these are obviously really beaten up, but you can
Yeah.
kind of see um, the triple Hecate around the polos. Sorry, wearing the polos. So even like wearing the different, like what she would wear in the statuary was indicative of like her role.
Ah, I like
This is
this.
interesting, right? Like,
And
so
also the context. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
gives you context of like why they would have placed her there and how they saw her. So, for example, like the fact that she has like this fancier dress on that, and she has fancy hair, like, so she's kind of fancy, um, which is indicative of that she's in high esteem. Because if she wasn't in high esteem, for example, she wouldn't be wearing a long skirt, she'd just have a short skirt. Like we've looked at different images of Artemis, who sometimes she was depicted wearing a short skirt, which is about youth, and so on. So, like in most of these statues, Hecate is like wearing a long fancy dress, which would have said a lot about her importance. And also, like that you're going into the temple. So these would have been temple statues placed at gateways, that you're going into the temple and it's, like it is important. Like it's kind of fancy. I know, like when we go to church these days, I think people just wear whatever they want to church for
Mhm.
most of the part. But like when I was a kid, like you had to get dressed up. Did you have to get dressed up to go to church when you were a kid?
No, but every once in a while, it was always charming to see those like older couples, for example, and how they still, they wear the hats and all those things.
And I think that's like also a form of like gatekeeping.
Yeah,
Like, right? Like, so part of going through a gate into a religious experience, it can be like dressing a certain way.
definitely, definitely.
And that
And it,
signifies another threshold we're crossing over, right? But through dress.
yeah, I also, it kind of invites the question of whether she was dressed in a different way based on what she was in front of. Did that kind of explain the context of the space that you were about to enter?
It's so interesting. So there's so much to learn from like studying these ancient statues.
Yeah.
And it's also, I wanted to point this out, this business of so we did Triformis, the three-parted goddess, a few months ago, and not always was Hecate depicted thus. This is an example of that, but as time went on, it became more common for her to be represented that way.
Mhm.
And that a lot of times these statues, when they were placed at thresholds, whether it's temples, the city, the home, they were triple formed because that way, like she could protect in all directions. It was like the best insurance policy.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. And basically, these ancient Propylaia figures that were at these gates and entrances, like they were like a type of insurance policy. Because I keep thinking about like how does this, if this is an archetype that is important to us as humans, like having protection for the home and having a spirit of protection for the home, a spirit of protection for the places we hold sacred, and our towns and so on. It's like, what is the spirit of protection these days? Like, you know, and I keep thinking like insurance policies technically should
Yeah.
be, but not really.
Well, hold on. Let me think this through. Well, to start with, in Italy, and I know that we've talked about this before, there's still that sort of like prophylactic aspect of having Medusa or sometimes a saint
Right.
in front of a door, or you have horseshoes. The insurance policies thing is interesting because it makes me think of something Hillman said about how we've desacralized objects by making them all replaceable. Like we don't have relationships with them anymore, so we don't take care of them and they don't take care of us. And insurance policies, in the way that you're talking about them, kind of does the same thing, right? Like, because it kind of implies that the only protection that I'm really concerned about with regard to my home is, if it's all destroyed, can it be replaced? Like, will I have the money to replace it, basically, is the extent of our protection, which is interesting from a
Right. Which
cultural.
isn't talking about the daemon or the spirit of the home,
Yeah.
like which is what these figures would have been working on that level, right?
Yeah.
That the
Yeah. We
spirit of
don't
the
really
home was what was more important.
yeah.
There may be important objects in it, but like this, the spirit, like what are we protecting? We're protecting the occupants, like in this kind of energetic sense, which I think we kind of really struggle with today.
But ironically, when people get robbed or when their house burns down, they always talk about the feeling of violation. So there is this sense that the house has a spirit, it's just not acknowledged in law or in our structure.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And then I
Mm.
would say like alarms, a lot of people have like home alarm systems.
Hmm.
And again, like it's so that I think that's goes beyond like what an insurance policy would do, but it gives you that sense, like, when you come in and you do the keypad, it's that same kind of thing, right? Like that this is supposed to be protective for
Yeah.
myself and the occupants. And it's like, well, I mean, it might be, um, but so we still like there is that need that we have to engage with some form of protection for like our spaces and ourselves. And I think if we look at what these ancient statues would have been part of, it's very much part of like things that we still do today.
Yeah. Yeah. This feeling, you want to feel safe there. So
Yeah.
you need this kind of gatekeeping energy or an alarm system.
Or an alarm system.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of us don't go to like churches or synagogues or temples anymore. So this experience of like going into that kind of dedicated sacred space, I think is really like something that a lot of us aren't familiar with. Like I grew up going to one of those like modern Pentecostal churches,
Mm.
and it was built in the 70s, so there was none of this kind of business about it. Plus Pentecostals don't like any of the statue business anyway.
Yeah. But also, trigger warning, I'm sorry about this, but in terms of churches or movie theaters or malls, now with sort of like the rash of shootings in the United States, like these spaces, I don't think that we realized how safe we felt in them until they stopped feeling safe to us. Like even schools, for example, those are places where you're supposed to feel safe and you really can't any longer.
I think that is such, I mean, obviously, like it's such a huge issue, right? All of
Yeah.
the violence going on in spaces that we used to consider safe. And, I think that's a big part of like the bittersweetness of like exploring the spirit of Propylaia is that,
Yeah.
like, oh, yeah, so she's the gate and she keeps out the bad ones and the good ones get in. And she's this kind of membrane and it's very mystical. Um, but then there's also like a bittersweetness, like if she is protecting these spaces, then there's a need to have them protected,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? There's a bittersweetness, and there's also this like bittersweetness, like to acknowledge that there is a need for protection, that there are forces in the world that would seek to harm. And I think
Yeah.
you just, I know it's very upsetting to talk about, But when we see how our like safe spaces have been so violated by this violence, and in some cases how like people feel that like there are things that the government could do to restore safety, and that the government is not willing to serve as like that kind of gatekeeper either.
Yeah. But I also wonder, what should that safety feel like? Because, for example, in Paris, after the November 13th terrorist attacks, there was all this concern about religious spaces, right? Like that they could be targeted or attacked. And at the time I was living really close to the Paris mosque. It's this really, really big and beautiful space. And for about the year after, and I think this was the same with 9/11, like a lot of people will have this experience, there were just these armed guards. In Paris, it's very rare to see cops or like to see army people with weapons, like it's really, really rare. And I had to walk by these guys every day, and every single time, like it made my heart jump into my throat, like they're designed for safety. But it just I don't know, it just made me feel anxious.
I think that's a good point, because there's that aspect of someone who's a gatekeeper too,
Yeah,
that you're not, like we mentioned earlier, like a bouncer, or if you are like a member of the police, and that's your job, to be that kind of gatekeeper in a space, that you are like that gate between lawlessness and order,
yeah.
that there's an intimidation factor to it. I was in the supermarket the other day, actually in the city, um, and I turned, like, I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, and I literally almost crashed into the police officer that was guarding the entrance to the supermarket. And like you said, and again, like it's still kind of rare, although it's increasingly common, that there's armed, like not security guards, but armed police
Mhm.
um, in supermarkets where I live.
Yeah.
And then I had an attack that I was like, oh my God, I don't have a mask on. But then it was fine. I did not, like, they did away with that. Then I was like, they did away with it. But there was that moment of like, oh, the gatekeeper is here.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think that opens us up to the broader discussion about like who are the gatekeepers in our society? Who are the Propylaia in our society? And how can we be more aware of who they are? And, just bringing that all into our consciousness as we get into the spirit of Propylaia, like really seeing where all these gates are all the time. Um,
I like that.
yeah, there's so much to take on. Here's another ancient source. This is Proclus's hymn to Hecate and Janus. So Janus, if you don't know who Janus was, two-headed god, interesting fella. So this is another example, like, of how ancient writers saw Hecate as this duality, like she can look in both ways at once. She's both, like, I guess, the fear of the unknown, and the one who protects you against the bad things that you might be afraid of. So she's like the spirit of like you're longing for whatever it is you're longing for, and she's going to keep you safe at the same time. So I really am deeply moved by this hymn, and it's one of the first ones I actually encountered when I was learning about Hecate. And I just love this. Maybe we should just read it. You want to read it? Can you see it okay to read it?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, you read it. I read the last ancient thing.
Okay. Hail, many names mother of the gods, whose children are fair. Hail, mighty Hecate of the threshold. And hail to you also, forefather Janus, imperishable Zeus. Hail to you, Zeus, most high. Shape the course of my life with luminous light, and make it laden with good things. Drive sickness and evil from my limbs. And when my soul rages about worldly things, deliver me purified by your soul-stirring rituals. Yes, lend me your hand, I pray, and reveal to me the pathways of divine guidance that I long for. Then shall I gaze upon that precious light, whence I can flee the evil of our dark origin. Yes, lend me your hand, I pray. And when I am weary, bring me to the haven of piety with your winds. Hail, many names mother of the gods, whose children are fair. Hail, mighty Hecate of the threshold. And hail to you also, forefather Janus, imperishable Zeus. Hail to you, Zeus most high.
So I love this because this is like Hecate Propylaia, Hecate of the threshold. And it's just so, it's such a beautiful prayer. Yes, lend me your hand.
It
Um,
also has a, I don't know if you feel this way, it has an Our Father energy.
it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
We'll have to
yeah.
do, maybe we can do a whole class on the Our Father prayer sometime. Not original. Obviously, the ideas in that prayer were already circulating in society at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into some more different ways Hecate was understood as a threshold. So, The Restless Dead by Dr. Sarah Ellis Johnson is such a rich resource on some deep, like this is a deep academic book. But one of the things I wanted to point out, like, so we did a Nodia last month, um, who has her oranges, has her oranges. She probably didn't have oranges. She would have pomegranates.
That was like an autocorrect, but with your mouth.
It was an autocorrect. It's because we're looking at all this gold because gold is the color of the month. And I'm just like, oranges. Oh, Anodia,
Yeah.
who is the Thessalian. It's hot. We might, yes. This is, we're not cool cucumbers like we are in the winter when we're doing these deep dives.
Hmm.
Um, anyway, back to the story. Enodia, of course, was associated with girls, women who were considered unclean for whatever reason because they had children out of marriage, or I don't know, they had an abortion, or they were a widow who knew was sleeping with. I don't. There's all this big, long, complicated list. Hasn't really changed in some places much today, but all of this business, and that in particular, Hecate was also associated with like these girls' transitions. So not only were these enotic aspects where women and girls who violated social norms, usually through no fault of their own, but there's
Hmm.
also this thing that Johnson talks about where Hecate was also a wedding attendant. And this, she was like Artemis. So her and Artemis often, like, they swap powers and they're very, intertwined in a lot of cases.
Yes.
So one of them, like, so there's this whole thing about liminality associated specifically, like Hecate Artemis, with women's transition. So if the transition goes wrong, and she ends outside of the norms of society, she's a spirit there. But if the transition goes well, she can be there to bless it. So there's this gatekeeping aspect really specific to girls' transitions. So
Hmm.
transition from being single to married, girl to mother, and so on. And then also the transition like of giving birth. So when you like when I widen the lens to be like, okay, Propylaia, the gate, it's a very physical thing. She's a shrine at a gate to a temple, or so on. It's also like, but this whole idea of Hecate's governance over transitions and the space, like the liminal space of the threshold between these transitions. Like, she's not necessarily the one who the temple is dedicated for, but she's there to help you get in. She's not
Yeah.
necessary, like maybe even like your primary house goddess or divinity that you are engaged with. But if you've got to make one of these transitions, you'll call on her. And she's the one, her Hermes are the one that's protecting the house. Do you know, like, was Hermes associated with, I know Hermes is associated with like keeping an eye on kids.
Hmm.
Um, but was he associated with like birth in any sense? I guess in some of the myths, he would have been like he was there to help people.
He was a, in Crete, he was a fertility god, but I don't have the most details on this, but the thing that I know, like, because there are lots of ways to think about fertility, right? So I haven't looked at this recently, but I do know that in his context as fertility god, he was also the god who was in charge of, we've talked about this before, heteric love, right? Like
Mhm.
that kind of road trip best friend's love or companionable love. So I'm not sure if he was related to birth specifically in the context of fertility. I suppose so, because that's what fertility is about. Yeah.
Right. But there's also like there's the front end of fertility when it's about getting like, and
Know
then
that.
there's the back end of fertility when it's time. So it's like, like, because a lot of people are like, well, Hecate has nothing to do with sex. And it's like, however, there's this like almost 3,000 years of historical record that she's associated with birth
Mm,
and women's transitions and
yeah.
violating social norms around fertility. So, yeah, she's not like tantric sex goddess, but she's there on the other side of all of this business,
Yeah, yeah.
you
This
know.
is also a great context for talking now about like how we're starting to finally understand the way that even gender is like it's a social construct, but it's also a spectrum. Like, you can sort of like transition through that as well, or like I don't. I'm going to talk about this in a dangerous way, so I'm going to stop. But I really like this association here. And this also reminds me of menstrual stories,
Mm.
because so often in menstrual stories you require an initiator, and the initiator is usually not a kind character. Like the initiator is usually somebody really scary and dangerous. For example, that's where we get the convention of like the evil stepmother or the scary witch. So this idea of sort of like being the guidepost for those transitions, and also more of the frightening aspects of Hecate, it concords really nicely with the menstrual stories tradition.
Yeah, it does. And it makes sense because the one who can help you through the transition, um, they also have the power to make things go wrong because they're
Yeah,
like the gate.
yeah,
Interesting.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have talked a lot about these hecateons or hecateons or however you want to pronounce it or spell it in English. There's different ways about these protective things. So we won't get back into this, but there was a lot of them. I think that's the thing to say. Like there's a lot of them that remain in different pieces. So,
I like this.
okay. And this just refers back to that procession of the key thing because we didn't do a deep dive into what that may mean yet. So the temple at Lagina, so there's an ongoing archaeological excavation of it, and they have found, I think, over the past couple of dozen years, like a lot of documents from this temple. So there's a lot of knowledge about what went on at this temple of Hecate at Lagina. And one of the truly fascinating things that was done at Lagina is this business where a young girl, um, like so not a like a prepubescent girl, like a tween, we would call her a tween today, um,
Yeah.
that she would do the procession of the key. She'd be attended by like more like Clydocus, the keepers of the keys, the priests, the officials, and she was usually like the daughter of like the high priest or the high priestess. Like this was a family business.
Mm-hmm,
So a
mm-hmm.
lot of like the temple at Lagina, like so you might be the girl who was the key bearer for that ritual. Then you would grow up to be a priestess in that temple, and you probably were doing that role as a girl because maybe your dad or your uncle was one of the high priestesses of that temple. So there was this whole kind of like it literally was like a family business.
Mm.
Um, but this whole like an and I've read different reports about like what this could have meant and why they did this because I think it's kind of unique, this key bearing ceremony, and there's something about this procession of the key that really, I don't know, it just kind of has a thrum for me, like it really makes, oh yeah, that's beautiful. um,
Mm.
but why would they do it?
Well,
um,
keep their power, right?
yeah. And that, so then this just carrying on from, we're still in the Restless Dead and talking about Restless Dead, what Sarah Johnson has to say. So what she says here that no, none of the sources explain what it was supposed to be doing. And so one of the things like if we look at our own life, what we record and what we don't record what everybody already knows,
Yeah.
right? Um, so basically, maybe it was so important that they didn't need to write it down. Like everybody just knew what it was for and why they did it. But it had to have been used to unlock or lock something significant, right? So again, that's the procession of going to Hecate with the key to unlock mysteries, unlock the city, both. Um, so it's really, just another one of those keys about this, the way the ancients understood Hecate's kind of governance over all kinds of gates.
Yeah. This reminds me of God, there are so many things coming to mind, but this reminds me of the secret name of Rome, right? Like, but the key standing in for the secret name, this idea that Rome had a name so secret that anybody who knew it could basically just take down the city. It was taken really, really seriously. It was a name that was kept by the cult of Angerona, this really interesting goddess whose finger is always over her lips to indicate silence. She's in a way, she's kind of a gateway goddess as well. But what I was thinking about was what you mentioned earlier, like this idea of, like if it's not recorded, it's because people generally already knew. Sometimes I suspect that in moments like this, these things kind of sneak into everyday life as conventions because they're not notable, right? Like, so you can't associate them with a cult. Like, I think about issuing a special person in the city the key to the city, this symbolic key, or cord cutting ceremonies. So the convention of the cord cutting ceremony, for example, in front of a new building, comes from ancient Egypt. And it was something that the pharaoh had to do symbolically hand in hand with the goddess Seshat, who was the goddess of architecture and astronomy. She's a lot like Hecate in the sense that she was the goddess of all kinds of things, like mathematics, writing, all sorts of things, but specifically also these new thresholds. So when a new building was erected, the pharaoh had to cut a cord symbolically alongside her to show that she was blessing this act. So I kind of wonder if the key had that same kind of significance. Like, even the fact that it's a prepubescent girl who has to do this, it makes me think of ring bearers in modern weddings, right? Like, why does that have to be a young child? And I don't know, like, it's not until you ask yourself this question that you're kind of like, I don't know, maybe but I don't know. Like, why does that have to be a kid? But there's also some resonance of this. There's like, a child is also symbolic of transitions, right? Like, in these types of moments.
Right, especially like a girl, on the cusp of womanhood.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
there's something there about, oh, she's transitioning too, but she's still pure. And so there
Yeah,
might be that purification aspect, like you said about, the Egyptian, like you're getting a blessing on your new building. And we
yeah.
still do these things today, like, a cord cutting ceremony, or like you said, you give somebody the key to the city, which is symbolic. They don't actually open things to the city.
But yeah,
Um,
like this idea that you can open I don't know, like, when you can open the whole city. I don't
like, so I
know.
guess that's like you're becoming a key holder of like the spirit of the city,
Yes.
that
Yes.
you've crossed through some kind of gate and
Yeah.
you've earned this place, like in this kind of inner sanctum, which only has a ceremonial purpose. It doesn't have any practical purpose.
Yeah. But that does bring us back to the topic of integration. It means
Hmm.
you've integrated into something. You have the right to this key now.
Okay, so now let's finish up
Hmm.
by stretching into the Chaldean oracles and Hecate's role as source or gate in the Chaldean oracles. So this is like deep philosophy. Um, and it's a lot to take in. People will say to me every once in a while, well, I'd like to read the Chaldean oracles. And inside I'm always like, no, you don't.
Yeah, you know a little too well. Yeah.
Like, you're better off with not knowing. So the Chaldean oracles are these collection of fragments that still exist. Um, even who wrote them, even who wrote them is a subject of discussion. What they're all like, there's a lot. This is not the Hecate Bible where I mean, the Bible's not like that either, right? Everything in the Bible is up to for interpretation.
Mm.
But and so in this collection of fragments, so the existing fragments, but also in other ancient philosophers who referred to them, Hecate plays this really kind of complex and also sort of singular role as this kind of membrane, which they use the moon to kind of symbolize that she's this membrane, and that through her, like, comes the channels of corporeal life and contains within herself the center of the procession of all beings. And it's like, you read that, you're like, what?
That's so vast.
It's so vast. It's like, what does that even mean?
What does that even mean? It's very anima mundi, though.
It is very anima mundi, and that in the Chaldean oracles, that's what they're describing. Like, Hecate is like the soul of the world, and that this soul of the world is this thing that we all like pass through to become us. Like, it's like she births us, but she's also this membrane, this gate that, in this kind of way of thinking, which is very like the ascension of the soul, and that, like, we're trying to become greater and ascend, like the Chaldean oracles is really approaching like the Gnostic kind of like, or a Christian, what we might call a Christian idea that, you do good things and you get to go to heaven. Like, they're really, that is kind of what's going on here.
Yeah.
So it's like
language. It's so strange. Like, a procession is not something that you would typically associate with having a center. It's by default transitional procession.
right. But so this is anima mundi, which they thought the world soul was feminine, but it's more complicated than that. And that they called it Hecate, which is interesting, right? Because you've got to think, like, the ones who were writing these texts, and we can debate, like, was this purely channeled? Is this something that's purely mystical, or is it contextual? And what they understood, like, we can debate that, but we'll never know the answer, obviously. So it's like, but we were looking at all of these different ways that Hecate was understood, like, as this kind of gate, and also the one who obviously, like, held the keys, because if you're the gate, you have the power to let people in and out, so you're also the key holder. Because the idea of Hecate as key holder of the cosmos is a big one in the Chaldean oracles and other related surviving texts as well.
I love this quote.
So she sends them forth. Like, she's not she's the source in a sense, but there's another source, like, beyond her.
Yeah, but she's also with you, like, through every gate of your procession, essentially.
Right.
Like, yeah, it's a strange, you have to hold two ideas at once in your mind. This idea of, like, going forth from her, but also moving through her at different aspects of your life. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And that, like, passing through the membrane, they kind of saw her as this membrane, that, like, she's both the membrane, but she's also like this force, like world soul force. So it's not like a fixed gate. It's almost like when you go through, like, the gate, she kind of comes with you.
Yeah.
Like, as you are ushered forth into corporal, physical form, that there's something that you carry with you. It's really fascinating. But certainly in the sense of, like, ascension ideology, like, whether you believe, like, in the kind of idea of, like, going to heaven or Christ consciousness or any of that business, like, this is kind of similar to that, in that there is this, like, Hecate is the source, and she is also like a broader soul or consciousness that can kind of play angelos, like a guide that can lead us up into the higher realms, which in the Chaldean oracles, they of course called the Heavenly Father, right? Like the greater source. It's very interesting. It should also be noted though that like I've read different papers that are saying like to call Hecate like female and the Great Father male, like in our kind of modern way of very like, well, not today, but the way we kind of had like hard gender role lines.
Yeah.
Like that's not how they would have seen it necessarily. That there was more, especially for the Neoplatonic thinkers behind the Chaldean oracles, like there was more fluidity. Um, that I read an article actually like written in the 80s, and they were like, oh, Hecate would have been seen as bisexual. And I was like, oh, well, the language has changed since then.
Yeah, language has changed a lot. But this was also quite common, right? Like we talk a lot about Philippine mythology and how the gods are, like they're kind of fixed now as these particular genders, but they were understood as fluid. And people who were gender fluid were understood as being closer to the liminal.
Right. And also like closer to the gate, whatever the gate would be.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Um, So I wanted to include this. So this is actually from Sarah Johnson's dissertation on Hecate, mostly in the Chaldean oracles, like this more kind of like upper world ascension ideology Hecate. Um, this is just one of the footnotes which I really found helpful in trying to decipher all of this business. So she's the mediating world soul that has a double aspect, that she looks towards the physical and what we might call the emotional. Like she's
Yeah.
looking, so it's more like she is this gate. She is the gate, but she's not. She's not the emotion. She's not the emotions. She's not the thoughts. She's not the physical world. She's not the deeper world. She can abide in both things, but she is somehow like she's the threshold between these things, all these things. She's the gate between them.
Yeah.
And this is just, I wanted to talk about this idea, like, and so this links to Hecate as, like, Hecate as the cosmic soul. So sometimes in the Chaldean oracles, people will translate anima mundi as like world soul, meaning like the soul of the world, like in the alchemist kind of sense. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also this whole like the cosmic soul, which is to me very Star Warsian, if that's a word.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's a word.
Well, it is.
That she's like the force. So she's not like all the stuff in the world. She's like the force, and she's like the gate that makes it all possible, basically. So this is so beautiful. Keyholder described aspects of Hecate that agree with his Proclus, ancient philosopher guy, portrayal of her as having the ability to bind together and harmonize diverse elements, to close the boundaries of things within the cosmos, to bring individual souls to fulfillment, um, as like a cosmic world soul. So there's this threshold aspect here, right? So what does a threshold or a gate do? It can delineate spaces, but it also joins spaces.
Yeah, it creates coherence between spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love this. I love this. And it also comes back to what we talked about at the beginning of this talk, which was that the Greeks understood what we thought of as consciousness as outside themselves, and it was always entangled with the material world. You had to always understand these two things at the same time.
Right, which is, I think that's what a threshold is always. Like, it's like, well, there is the material and there is the deeper, the spiritual. And even within ourselves, like there is like, the like the more emotional, and then there is the more cognitive, like that Hecate as an idea is neither one of these things, but she's like the force that conjoins them or delineates them, like that she's that space, that she's like that gate between all things, which makes me think of like in terms of like even like in terms of our own neurochemistry, like everything has to cross a threshold. Like there is a gate, like at all of our individual neurons, and like something has to happen. There has to be an action potential, and that can trigger the gate to work, and then the neuron will have a chain of events, and good things will happen or bad things will happen. And I think like a lot of us are so focused like on our anxiety or our depression, like there's all of that business, like, but that really functions on like these neuronal gates
Yeah,
that
yeah.
set off this whole chain of events.
This makes me think too about, I think we've all had that experience of being confronted by a decision that traps us between emotions and logic, and we don't know what side to fall on. And it's that feeling that it has to be this combination of both, but the murkiness of that place, like the discomfort of that, is the place where we don't want to sit, but it's kind of the place where we kind of sense that the answer is like sort of like being pulled between these two things.
Oh yeah, it's so true. Or
Yeah,
like, I mean, I could just totally like geek out on the neurology of this. Like the corpus callosum that joins the two half of our brains. If that is severed, we can't function. Like they used to do this to people. I think it's a
like
treatment for epilepsy and other things. But if you sever the connections between our brains, like we literally can't function. And so that's like the gate that joins the two halves of our brains.
it's fascinating, that cohesive gate.
Right? That cohesive gate, even though nothing is done to either half of our brain, if those connections, those neurons that connect the two halves of our brain, if they're severed, there's no like straightforward or reason organically that we
Yeah,
that our brains couldn't do the tasks without the connections, but we can't do the tasks without the connection. So the gate is also the connector,
yeah.
right?
That sort of implication that these two spaces require a symbiosis as well.
Exactly. So there's all that business about gates too. We are, of course, reach the point in our class where we run into the witches and the scarier side of Hecate. So we're doing a deep dive on Medea, and her bittersweetness, her the gates she crashed and was dragged through all the gates in Medea's life, like all the troubles she got into. So, when we talk about Hecate, one of the most fascinating aspects of her, it's like, so we have philosophy and we have this and we have that. And then it's like, and we have um, a lot of like plays and curse tablets and so on that say that she was very much also this kind of scary spirit that you summoned when you needed some dirty deeds done dirt cheap kind of thing. So
Yeah.
we're going to talk about Medea, and we'll be talking about like Hecate and how these authors of these plays, like what might have been going on in their heads that they
Yeah.
made Hecate this kind of spirit.
Yeah, I look forward to that conversation. That's going to
I
be
look
really
forward to that conversation too because one of the things like when I don't know when you're like learning about these ancient historical sources, it's like, but Euripides was writing himself a play, right? Like it wasn't like it was meant to be taken literally,
yeah, it's like taking Shakespeare literally.
right? And it's like, but Hesiod was writing something different. It was like an index.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So it's like if you know the nature of the document you're talking about, it really helps to contextualize, um, what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I did some research on that, like the sort of context in which Euripides wrote the play, and as you mentioned, like this question of why Medea kills her children,
Hmm.
and why he constructed the play that way. So that'll be a good conversation, I think.
So that's coming up, I think, on August the 12th, and we're going to do it live just because it's summer. We're
Yes.
doing it live for a treat. All right, thanks so much for watching. As always, we're looking forward to your comments and thoughts about this deep dive into Propylaia.
Thanks, everyone.